He's in the prison. And Potiphar's wife is up in this expensive home, eating expensive food. But who's the one who is really free? Who's the one who's really free? Joseph is the one who's really free from sin. Whereas Potiphar's wife, she's not free from sin. It's controlling everything about her, or she wouldn't have been chasing this young handsome slave and lying about him. We are in Genesis chapter 39, and our boy Joseph here has been sold as a slave to Potiphar, the captain of the bodyguard of Pharaoh. And Potiphar's wife has been tempting Joseph to have an adulterous affair with her. And Joseph has been resisting this. And so Joseph is in a position where he's tempted to have this sexual sin. This woman is almost demanding sex with him. And Joseph knows it is a sin and says not only it is a sin against Potiphar, but it's a sin against God. And so we know from that sin against other people is, yes, sin against them, but it's also a sin against God. There's never a sin that's only suffered by us. It's a sin against the Lord God first, and it also hurts people around us. So that's where we are. This woman has been tempting Joseph, and he's been trying to avoid her. So we'll pick up in Genesis 39:11 and find out what happens to Joseph. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside." So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came in to me to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside." Now when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, in the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. So at this point, Joseph has been accused by this woman of trying to molest her, trying to attack her, when really he was innocent. He had been trying to avoid her, and as doing his business, he had to be around her. He couldn't avoid her. She grabs his garment, his shirt or his coat or his outer garment, and he runs away. And then she accuses him of trying to attack her, trying to molest her. So here's a question, Steve. What could Joseph have done to try to avoid this trap? Was there any way he could have gotten out of this?
It seems like maybe he could have gotten out of it by just staying out of the house and away from her altogether. However, he was in charge of the household, and it's clear in this portion that we read here, he had duties inside the household. Now, he could have taken an extra step, though, to make sure that anytime he was in there, he had other people there. In this situation, nobody else was there except for him and her. So while he had duties inside the household, he possibly should have said, anytime I'm going to do anything in the household, you or a couple of people, you have to be with me, so that he'd have protection from this.
And wise Christians follow that advice still today. It's a very good idea for men and women not married to each other to always have people around them. I've known pastors that have been very careful with this, to set up situations where they're never really alone with a woman. I remember one church that I was in, they had glass doors on the pastor's office, and the church secretary could see in to the offices to where there was nothing in there going on unseemly. but yet they could always talk privately through the glass doors, things like that. Never get into a car with a woman or go on have a lunch meeting or anything like that with somebody of the that you're not married to. And so there's steps you can take to do that. And from the text, it would seem that Joseph was attempting to do this, but for one reason or another, this day at this time, he had to be in the house and felt he couldn't do his job without being in there. And she accuses him falsely, lies about him. And so now he's in a bit of a spot. He runs away and leaves his garment. So it was his coat or his shirt. So what did Jesus say over in the New Testament to do if we're in a position for sin? What did he say? Like if our eye causes us to sin, what does he say?
He uses hyperbole and says, pluck it out. If our hand causes us to sin, cut it off. And it's just a way to show how the seriousness the sin is. And I believe Paul in one of his epistles gives a direct instruction to flee from sin. And this is a perfect example of that, how Joseph fled from this potential sin.
1 Corinthians 6:18, flee sexual morality. So Joseph did exactly that, was to run. He physically ran. And so we need to metaphorically run and sometimes physically run away from sexual sin. It's so tempting because it's such a biological desire and it's such a natural desire for reproduction and sex and things. And the pleasure there has been the fall of many a man and many a woman. And so we need to take these advice very seriously from the Bible, is to flee sexual morality. And the good news here, though, Steve, is that Joseph didn't give in. He didn't give in. He ended up in this compromising circumstance, but what he didn't do was give in to sin. He fled. We should all strive to be like Joseph. And if we have to, physically run away from sin. And finally, in this family, Steve, we have somebody who is righteous. Of all the sins that Jacob did and Laban did and Rebekah and all these people, we've read them off. There's this long string of ugliness. Finally, we have someone in this family that is following God's commands, that is living righteously, and he fled. He didn't give in to the temptation. Now he's going to be falsely accused and he's going to end up in jail, but nevertheless he's suffering unjustly for a circumstance, but he can still stand before God and say, I didn't give in. I fled the sin and fled the sexual immorality. And so that's how we need to be. How can we be more like Joseph? And when we get into these trying circumstances, we want to be able to look God in the eye and say, I held and didn't sin.
One way to know what to do in these type of situations are to review any type of a situation that might come up and make a decision on what you will do if it does occur.
Or when it does occur.
Yes. In the moment of maybe a lustful situation, you've already made a decision prior to that. What are my options going to be? What am I going to do?
In this situation, this immoral woman was trying her best to have this sinful relationship with Joseph, but he held firm and he ran away and he didn't give in. So I take it that this means that avoiding these kind of things, these temptations and these trials, builds faith and character. We can point to Joseph here as someone who has a strong character. He has a strong moral fiber. Why? Because he got into these situations and fled. So these type of situations build faith and character. They build faith and character. And the reason is because that's how we're tried. It talks in the New Testament a lot about trials. And so the trials are things that it stresses us, We may be tempted to sin, but overcoming that is what builds faith and character. That's how we need to strive to be, is someone that overcomes these things. The Bible talks about being free from sin, free from sin. So think of it here, Steve. We have, at the end of this passage we just read, Joseph is in the jail. He's in the prison. And Potiphar's wife is up in this expensive home, eating expensive food. But who's the one who is really free? Who's the one who's really free? Joseph is the one who's really free from sin. Whereas Potiphar's wife, she's not free from sin. It's controlling everything about her, or she wouldn't have been chasing this young handsome slave and lying about him. She's the one that's in bondage to sin, and Joseph is the one that's free. And so what lesson can we learn from that in our day?
We can learn that in order to be free from sin, we need to have a relationship with Jesus Christ. And that through that relationship, we become a new creature, we become a new creation, and that we can have that freedom away from the pull of sin that comes on people that don't have a relationship with Jesus.
What kind of bondage does sin put us in? Because this woman, she thought she was free, but she was really the one that was in bondage. What kind of bondage does sin, especially lustful sins, what kind of bondage do people end up in?
It's really a tremendous bondage. It starts out small. I've heard a pastor put it this way before: sin will take you further than you ever wanted to go, and it'll keep you longer than you ever intended to stay. And so that's exactly how sin works. It's something that starts out small. It starts out many times as something that you think that you can control. And in the end, it just kind of snowballs and keeps going and going and going. Then all of a sudden, you find yourself in a situation where possibly you say, I can't get out of this. And then you're afraid to get out of it. You don't know what to do. And it will have a devastating effect on your relationship with God if you don't take care of it early on, and if you actually do things to try and prevent from falling into this sin.
The one way out of the bondage of sin is to have a new nature on the inside. We learned about this when we studied Colossians, is that when we have a new nature, then we're no longer tempted by the sin. We've been set free from the slavery that comes with sin. So here's the next question. How does it feel to be regenerated and now be free from the bondage of sin? How does that feel?
It feels great. It's a feeling that it's hard to describe to people that haven't experienced it, because many times they'll say, oh, that's just fairy tale. That's just a myth. There is no God. You're a fool. You're just believing things that don't exist. Or they also say, there is no proof that there's a God. Well, there is proof. And whenever you place your faith on God and that there is God in Jesus Christ and what he's done with his death, burial, and resurrection, then you do have proof. The proof that you're a changed person, that is proof in and of itself. But that's hard to explain to a person who is completely on his own and completely doesn't want to have anything to do with God. It's just hard to explain to them. On the other hand, I've seen and talked with people who their story is for years and years and years, that's exactly how they were. They didn't want to have anything to do with God. They didn't think God existed. But yet, once they were convicted and they gave their life to Jesus Christ, then they understood exactly, and they now know that there is proof that there is a God.
Look at verse 14. It says, she called to the men of the household and then told them this lie about Joseph attacking her. So she was very familiar with the men. She knew all about the men and who to talk to. It also says in that passage that, notice the language, he has brought into us a Hebrew. And in verse 17, it says again, this Hebrew that you brought. So she makes a point to bring up the fact, oh, this was a Hebrew. This was a Jewish person. So she's just a little bit prejudiced here, just a little bit racist, where she's saying, oh, this Hebrew that you brought in, he's the one. So now she's distancing herself. She had this forbidden fruit, right, that she couldn't get because he wouldn't give in. She wanted it. She lusted for Joseph, and he wouldn't give in. He stayed righteous. And because he was this distant fruit, the lust built up until he ran away one day. And now she's angry. Now she's turned on him. She's lying about him. She's pointing out, oh, he's a Hebrew. So we see the true character of this woman, which is a pretty low character.
It's also an indication that they were looked down upon, that they were looked as being something different. And you can get that from this because she uses that one word, Hebrew, twice. As you mentioned, that's a hot button. That's a key thing in her accusation, because just with that one word, she can bring up all the connotations that had come apparently with a Hebrew and what a Hebrew was and what they were. So she was using that in order to manipulate the situation and to bring emotion into it with the men that she was talking to convince them more that she was in the right and he was in the wrong by a diversion tactic. Oh, he was a Hebrew. And immediately that brings into their mind negative connotations that whatever it was in that time period. I know for one thing for sure, it tells us later that the Egyptians wouldn't eat with the Hebrews. So they saw them as being different, and they saw them being as lower class for sure.
She tells her husband, this Hebrew that you brought. So she's blaming Joseph. She's blaming her husband. You brought this Hebrew. So she's blaming everyone else but herself. This is a very self-centered woman that has given herself over to these physical sins, and she's blaming other people about it, will not admit her own faults. She is a very lost person that's very controlled by her own lust and her own sins. It's an ugly picture of someone who's wholly given over to sin, and so much so that she will not admit that it was her fault that these things occurred and that she was having a very innocent man thrown in prison. So Joseph is falsely accused, and he gets thrown into the jail, thrown into the prison. And so if we were to put ourselves in Joseph's sandals at this point, what does it feel like to be falsely accused? Because he was lied about, falsely accused. What does that feel like?
It's not good. I've been falsely accused at one point in my working career early on, and it's unsettling.
If we summarize what's happened to this point in the story, look at what happened to Joseph so far. His father chastised him for having dreams. His brothers chastised him for having these dreams. His brothers took him out, probably beat him up, planned to kill him, threw him in a hole, took his coat, sold him off into slavery. He gets a job with this man Potiphar, but in doing so, when he's sold into slavery, he loses any inheritance that he may have had with his family. So, okay, a little bit up, he gets a nice job with this man Potiphar, but the wife lies about him when all he's trying to do is to do his job and keep his own integrity. And now he's thrown into prison. So at this point, how would a typical person think? What would the thoughts be going on in our mind if we're trying to be godly people and all I was doing is trying to follow God's commands, and now I'm falsely accused and I'm in jail? Whereas, okay, if I would have given into the sin, this might not have happened, but I was trying to be righteous before God, and now I'm falsely accused, thrown into prison. What's going through the mind of the average person at this point?
Well, one thing that you mentioned was, if I had fallen into the sin, this would not have happened. That is something that's a fallacy to believe, and people do fall into that, because what happens is that if she lied about this one time, she could lie about it any time. So you fall into the sin one time, and nothing happens. All of a sudden she approaches you again. And so you feel that you got to fall into the sin a second time. Then you're approached again and again and again. And before you know it, you're deeply involved in it. Then when you try and stop it, guess what? Same story comes up, possibly. Same story that she used the first time is going to be the same story after the 5th time or the 10th time. So that for sure is one thing. Don't believe that, oh, it's just one time. If I can fall into the sin, there's nothing else I could have done. No. Do what Joseph. Use Joseph as an example and flee. Yes, there might be consequences that don't seem like they're fair, but God is going to honor you fleeing. And I can tell you, it's better in the long run to be on God's side than it is to be on a side where you're embroiled in a sinful situation.
Very true. So true. I think of a drug addict or an alcoholic. The old saying was a man takes a drink and then the drink takes the man. Because once you give into these sins, then now the sin is controlling you. That's the language that the New Testament talks about sin, is that we become a slave of sin. And so if Joseph would have given in to this woman, he would have been her slave, and a slave of the adultery. And so it would have been much worse. Better to be falsely accused and thrown in prison and still have your integrity before God than to be a slave of sin in a fancy palace and be as miserable as this woman was. Now, with this though, look at what's happened to Joseph. Sold into slavery, falsely accused, in prison. Seems like Joseph's having a string of bad luck, but what's really happening? What's really happening is God put Joseph right where he wants him. He's got him right where he wants him. God is working things out for his purposes, and God is placing Joseph in this prison for a purpose. That's one of the main themes of the last half of Genesis, is God's hand of providence is working through all these circumstances to accomplish God's will. That's where we are. Now, the other thing, before we read the next passage, God did not appear directly with Joseph. There's no record up to this point of God speaking directly with Joseph, but God is there every step of the way. With all of these events, God's hand is there with him. It's said directly at the beginning of the chapter, God was with him, but we don't have God speaking to Joseph directly. There's no grand visions here. He didn't see like the ladder with the angels going up and down, no dramatic visions like that, but God is there every step of the way. And God is working through these events to put Joseph right where he wants him. And we can take courage from this.
Glenn, let's pause here, because there's something that you say quite often, that God is working through the free will acts of people. And you just said it here in a different way. You said God is working through these events. So I want to make it clear to our audience that when you said God has got Joseph exactly where he wants him, that God is not decreeing this to happen. In other words, God is not causing Potiphar's wife to entice Joseph. And Joseph is where he is because his brothers, on their own volition, sold him into slavery. And Joseph is now in jail because Potiphar's wife, on her own volition and free will, chose to go after him and try and entice him. But God is still working through these people's free will acts to bring about his providence and to bring about what he wants to do with the Jacob's family. We'll see that towards the end of this book, but can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a couple of times we're going to see before we get to the end of the book, it says flat out, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So we have, the way I see it is it's both true that human free will is going on and God's hand of control is on this as well. So God can providentially work through and accomplish his will that he has determined to happen from eternity past, but he doesn't do that by overshadowing or controlling human free will. A human free will is not like a puppet or a glove that God would put on, and God uses us like an instrument. The logicians call it an instrumental cause. Humans are not a tool like a hammer or a saw or a sewing needle or something like that. No, we have a nature, and our nature is free will. But so all the characters in the story can act openly in free will and have the power of contrary choice. But in the end, God can say, I controlled this all the way through to accomplish my will. And so I see both of those. And he sums it up a couple of different times at the end of the book where he says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And it talks about God determining that these things are going to be this way. But nevertheless, everybody in the story, like you said, Potiphar's wife, it was her lust and her decision and her choice to give in to her own lust. And it's Joseph's choice to run away because he knew that it was God's command to flee sexual immorality. So I just see both God's hand and human free will, and there's just no violation. It's not one or the other. It's both. Now, the other contrast we can get here. Remember what Joseph just did. He fled sexual immorality. Joseph had a brother named Judah, who a chapter or two ago, what did he do? So there's this great contrast between these two brothers, Judah and Joseph. Judah gave in to the temptation of Tamar. Joseph resisted the temptation of Potiphar's wife. Judah left behind, remember, he left behind his staff and his signet. Joseph left behind his garment. So we have this contrast here between Judah, who gave into the sin and ended up with this horrible situation of sin, and Joseph, who didn't give into the sin and had this wonderful example of righteousness. And yet they both parallel with whether or not they gave in to the temptation to the woman and leaving behind an object. And so there's these wonderful literary parallels between this that I think are fairly obvious what God is teaching here. Yes, it's true history, but it's also wonderful literature. Moving on to the next one. Steve, if you could start at verse 21 and read down to verse 23.
But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. The chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper.
So it says twice there, once in verse 21 and the other in verse 23, the Lord was with him. So remember, where is he? He's in jail. He's in prison, but the Lord is with him. Is it possible that we can be in unpleasant, painful circumstances, but the Lord be with us? Well, it says it flat out right there. So why is it that when we in our day think, oh, something pleasant is happening that feels good, therefore the Lord's with me, and here's something else that's really kind of a cold prickly that's really doesn't feel good at all, oh, the Lord must not be with me? But a lot of times in the Bible, it's just the opposite. Can the Lord be with us even though I'm in a painful circumstance?
You know, when you look at it that way, Glenn, do we really want the Lord to be with us? Do we want to use Joseph as an example of the Lord being with us? Well, yes, of course we do, when we see how the story turns out. But I want to bring us back again, just real quickly. Joseph had the dreams where his family was going to bow down to him. He gets sold into slavery. Well, and the Lord's with him, but how much worse can it be? God's going to work this out some way. Now he's in jail. So he's going worse. He's going the opposite direction. So yeah, the Lord's with him, but he's going the opposite direction. I just keep coming back to that. Okay, Lord, you gave me these dreams where the family was going to bow down and serve to me, but I'm going and you're with me. but I'm going in the opposite direction. It's got to be a little bit of a confusing situation to Joseph.
He's in jail in a foreign country. And how in the world can God bring it about, since I had this word from God many years ago? Well, guess what? We have a word from God that came to us many years ago, and we can't always see how it's going to work out. But nevertheless, God will bring these things about because he is the one who is just. How can we tell the difference in our day if we can't tell the difference in whether it feels good or feels bad on whether God's working through us? How can we know whether God's working with us? And I submit that sometimes we can't. Sometimes we can't. One thing I know is that, am I suffering because of my own sin? Sometimes I suffer because of my own sin, in which case God's not in that. It's just my fault because of my sin. I think we can take confidence as Christians in knowing that God can work all things together for Christians that are called according to his name, Romans 8:28. We can know this, just like you were pointing out with Joseph's visions. He can know, hey, God promised to be with me. He promised to be with me. So therefore, I'm in a situation I don't understand. I don't know why I'm here. It's painful. It's an ugly situation, but God made a promise. And he's going to be with me because he promised. He promised me in Romans 8:28, all things are going to work together for good to those who love him and are called according to his name. So therefore, somehow, some way, God's going to work good out of this. And I think the other lesson we can learn, Steve, is that we shouldn't determine what God is doing by whether or not it feels good. It could be God's doing this wonderful, grand work for something that's unpleasant, doesn't feel good. God can work through unpleasant circumstances. We can determine if we're in God's will by whether we're obeying his word. Joseph can say, I'm in God's will because I obeyed his commands. And if we look in these verses, verse 22, God is blessing Joseph again, just like he did at Potiphar's house. And he's doing what could be considered very mundane labor. Very mundane labor. I mean, what kind of job you got in a prison? It's got to be pretty mundane, not clean, all these kind of things. How can we honor God when we're doing mundane, regular routines? If I'm cleaning the bottom of the prison, can I still honor God?
If I'm sitting here thinking while you were talking there, Joseph knows that God is with him because he prospered him while he was in Potiphar's house. So he's at least been put in the best situation as a slave in somebody's house, in that he's over the household. Now he's in jail, and Joseph knows that God is with him because he's prospering Joseph in the jail and has put him in the best situation that you can be in jail by being over everybody else in the jail. And the jailer lets him do whatever he wants to be in charge of that jail. So we don't have any indication that Joseph is complaining about his situation, but we do have indication that Joseph knows that God is with him. We need to take a learning from that. The situation that we are in, even though it might be something that we don't like from maybe a work situation, are we being prospered in that work situation? If we are, maybe and quite possibly it's God prospering us if we're dedicated to him and we're committed to him and we're letting him control our life. And if that's the case, then let's let God continue to work out what he's working out, and let's not complain about it. And let's see how things work out. This is some sort of a lesson I think that we can get from Joseph's life.
Even though we have very unpleasant jobs, sometimes painful jobs. I mean, Joseph, whatever he was doing, cleaning the bottom of the jail, that's not a job that most of us would get real excited about. But nevertheless, God's hand was on him. And I think Joseph realized that God's hand was on him. And he made the best of what he had, and God used him. As we're going to see, God used him, and God uses the circumstances. We can see God work in our daily routines, even though they're mundane, even though they may be unpleasant. And if we ask ourselves whether it was hard for Joseph to keep going, well, I think if he sees God's hand in this, then I think maybe no. It would have been easy for a human side to get discouraged, but I think from a divine standpoint, God's got him in a situation. God's working through him in every situation. And I think there's joy in obeying the Lord, even when we suffer for it. And that's the lesson here. There's joy in obeying the Lord, even though the world causes us to suffer for it. And I think we can learn a great lesson from Joseph here in that. So that's where we're going to end today. Our man Joseph here is in a bad spot. He's falsely accused. He's thrown into prison. But nevertheless, God's hand is upon him, and God's going to use him in this prison. And we'll see that next time as we continue to reason through the Bible.
As always, we thank you so much for watching and listening. May God bless you.